And that realization, that's a bloody miracle. Who thinks that? Like that's a tough one to get going, that one. And yet it happened. And it certainly was part of the doctrine that guided the formation of your country, right? Certainly the doctrine that led to the development of the democracy that characterized Great Britain before your country separated from its mother, let's say. But the people who founded your country made that more explicit, and it's still working. And so you ask yourself, well, do you believe that? Do you believe that slavery is wrong implicitly? So the answer is simple. It's either yes or no. If it's yes, then you profess belief in something like the inviolate dignity and worth of the individual, no matter how lowly, right? That's irrelevant in some sense, which is really quite remarkable. And so, anyways, when God tells Moses what to say to the Pharaoh, he says, say to him, let my people go. It's a very famous line, right? It's the rallying cry of the civil rights movement, let's say. It's certainly the rallying cry in some sense of those who fought against slavery when it was fought against. And the British did that en masse. Under the pressure, by the way, of biblically oriented thinkers in the parliamentary houses in Britain. So William Wilberforce in particular, who's a man worth looking up. But, you know, that isn't exactly what God says. He doesn't say, let my people go. He says, let my people go so that they may serve me in the wilderness. And that's a whole different idea, right? Because let my people go means you shouldn't be subject to compulsion. Absent compulsion, you're free. Freedom is the freedom to do whatever you want. And the problem with that is, well, how much trouble do you get into when you just do what you want? Right? I mean, you tell your children, you can't just do what you want. And what you mean by that is, you can't guide your life by allowing yourself to be subject to the whims of your immediate desire. And why not? It's like, well, it doesn't work very well in the long run. I saw a Simpsons episode where Homer drank a quart of vodka and mayonnaise, and all at once. And Marge said, I don't think that's a very good idea. And Homer said, that's a problem for future Homer. Which is like, that's one of the best lines ever, I think. It's like, yeah, well, that's why you tell your children that they can't just do what they want. It's like, well, that'll pose a problem. You act like that, people won't like you. It's like, well, so what? It's like, well, no, you don't understand. People won't like you. That's not a good strategy. So you have to regulate your motivated whims in accordance with some principle of social unity, let's say. And if you have a popular child, you know, one who's truly popular and engaging, then that's how they conduct themselves. They're a good partner in play, let's say. They can take the perspective of another person. They're good at taking turns. They're good sports on the playing field, right? They're reciprocal in their interactions. It's very sophisticated. They're regulating their moment-to-moment desire by reference to a higher order structure of ethics that's governed by a very sophisticated underlying set of principles. And that's freedom. If freedom isn't the freedom to just do what you want in the moment. And the reason that's not freedom is because, you know, the movie Pinocchio, you've all watched that, I imagine, or virtually all of you. You know, there's a series of temptations that Pinocchio is subject to as he's striving to shed the strings by which he's manipulated and become autonomous and genuine. And being a neurotic victim, by the way, is one of his temptations. He's convinced at one point by the fox and the cat that he's a sick victim, and that the proper antidote to that is a nice trip to Pleasure Island where you can do whatever the hell you want. And that's what happens. He goes there with a delinquent named Lampwick, who's an avatar of demonic forces, essentially, hence his name. And he's also an acolyte of the coachman, who, for all intents and purposes in that story, is Satan himself. He even turns into a figure like that at one point in the movie. And what happens on Pleasure Island is that everyone there turns into a braying jackass who's then sold as a slave. And that's right. That's exactly what happens. And that's why freedom is not the pursuit of impulsive hedonistic pleasure. That doesn't work. It's the freedom to abide by the proper set of divinely ordered principles. That's a better way of thinking. That's why God insists that the antidote to slavery is not mere absence of structure, right? Let my people go. It's no. Let my people go so they may choose a better path, which is service to the divine, in substitution for the tyranny and the slavery. And that's also something, by the way, that the founders of your country knew, because they understood full well that the freedom that was the aim, let's say, of those who established your state was the freedom of a good and proper citizenry, right? It was a responsible freedom. Now, what came along with that freedom was the opportunity to make hedonistic mistakes. You can say whatever the hell you want. And in some sense, you can do whatever you want too. But just because you have that opportunity doesn't mean that that's where you find true freedom. And we could look into that a little bit more deeply and think about what sort of freedom you might actually want if you wanted to be free in the way you would want to be free if you were wise. And we could think about that in relationship to something like a game. Imagine you're playing a game. It doesn't really matter what it is. Imagine you're just playing one-on-one basketball. Well, first of all, do you want some rules or not? And the answer is, well, I want to play basketball. And so are the rules of basketball rules? Right? Or are they enabling principles? Right? Because you can think of rules as constraints. You know, why can't I just drop the basketball into the hoop? It's like, well, that wouldn't be any fun, would it? So, or you can think about them as enabling principles, like the principles that allow musicians to compose music instead of just produce noise. You can think of that as a constraint, but it's not really a constraint. Without those enabling principles, you wouldn't have the game, and without the game, you'd have less freedom, not more. And so that's a strange thing, you know, that the presence of those enabling principles can produce a wider range of interesting and bounded opportunities. And then you think, well, if you're playing one-on-one basketball, who do you want to play with? And you might think, well, I want to play with someone I can just stomp. It's like, well, that's kind of shallow, you know. And it's not going to be fun for long. You might do a hand pump after you demolish your, 3-year-old opponent, and you're the victor. But, you have to be pretty dim-witted to think of that as an attainment. And so that's interesting because it means that sheer victory in the game is obviously not the goal. Because if you wanted sheer victory, you'd just pick a pathetic opponent and you'd crush them, and maybe you would do that if you're narcissistic, but even then, you have to be narcissistic and pretty dim to want to do that ever. So what do you want instead? You want to pit yourself against someone who's pretty evenly matched to you, or maybe even a little better. And that's interesting. Why even a little better? And maybe it's because you don't want an easy victory. Well, and that's strange too, because if victory is the goal, why wouldn't you want it to be easy? And the answer is, well, victory isn't actually the goal. Difficult victory is the goal. Why difficult victory? Because you have to get better while you pursue the victory. And then the victory isn't the victory. The victory is getting better. And so you want to play a difficult game. And the game has to be governed by enabling principles. And a game governed by enabling principles makes you actually free. And so that's part of what is meant by the spirit of God speaking to Moses to chastise the Pharaoh and to entice the Israelites into freedom. And so that's like one of 100 things we discussed in this Exodus seminar. And they all had that, many of them had that level of significance. And so it was unbelievably illuminating to me. I'm very much looking forward to the next batch where we can finish. We stopped right when the Ten Commandments made themselves apparent, and so sort of right at the peak of the story, and I'm very much looking forward to reconvening. But if you found what I just told you interesting, and you found the Genesis lectures interesting, then you'll definitely find the Exodus seminar interesting. And when I get through it and the next one, so I'm through the whole story, I'm going to do a series of public lectures on Exodus as well. And I set up the seminar in part because, well, I thought it would be interesting to convene all these people since I was able to do it. And but I also thought I would be able to walk through the story in depth by being informed by all these other people. And so that when I did have the opportunity to explore its structure publicly, that I would have made myself as informed in doing so as I possibly could. And so I'm really excited about this coming out because there are some insights in there provided that really took my breath away. Things that, one of them in particular, which I won't go into, but I'll give you a hint, a teaser, you might say. Jonathan Pageau explained to all of us at the group, so when the Israelites are lost in the desert, this is relevant because you're going to be lost in the desert at some point. So the desert is where you go when your tyranny dissolves. And that's worth knowing, because you might say, well, why would you insist upon your tyrannical presumptions even if you know them to be false? Because you do that to yourself and to other people. And the answer is, well, when you let go of your tyrannical presuppositions, you don't end up in the promised land. You end up lost in the desert, right? Anxious, uncertain, directionless, hopeless, faithless, confused, fractious, combative, disunited, fighting, right? Petty, disorganized. It's not all that compelling an option to the tyranny, which is also why, and that's why people, once having established a tyranny, are somewhat loath to let it go. And that's very much worth knowing. The question that might arise out of that is, well, if you have let go of the tyranny and you're in the desert, what do you use to guide yourself? And the answer that's put forth in the Exodus story is that God makes himself manifest in the desert as a pillar of fire during the night and a pillar of cloud during the day. And so, what does that mean? And I didn't know what it meant, but Jonathan Pageau knew what it meant. And he told all of us, and so, if you want to find out. I'd like to tell you, but it's complicated, you know. I'm not holding out on you. It is complicated, but it's worth knowing because there'll come a time in your life when you are in the desert because things have fallen apart around you, and you're going to need to know what you can rely on when you're lost. I mean, if you know what to rely on when you're lost, you're not lost anymore. And so that's a good thing to know. And I found his explanation, like it gave me visions for about 2 days afterwards. It was unbelievably compelling. And I think he nailed it, And how do I know? I've thought a lot about how you know when something's true. And that's a complicated question. And there's many answers. But one answer is many disparate sources of evidence point to the same conclusion simultaneously. And so what scientists try to do when they're attempting to determine whether something is actually there, rather than just part of their imagination, let's say, or a delusion, is they measure it in multiple different ways using multiple independent observers, and if there's convergence across multiple measurements, then the assumption is it's probably there. And you do the same thing all the time. That's why you have 5 senses and not one. It's like, well, something's there if you see it. It's like, no, because then you just have eyes. How do you know if something's there? You can taste it and touch it and hear it and feel it and see it at the same time, right? And even then, you're not certain, because then you go ask some other people and they do the same 5-dimensional process of convergence and discuss the outputs with you, and maybe do that with a bunch of people. And then if all of that converges, you think, maybe it's there. And so Pajot explained his hypothesis about the meaning of the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud, and when he dropped that crystal seed into the supersaturated solution of our seminar, it just went, it's like, oh yes, here's 10 reasons why that definitely makes sense. And so that was stunningly useful. And so anyways, those are a couple of things that are coming up. There's much more of them. So keep an eye out for the Exodus seminar. And if you want to sharpen up your writing so you can think, so that you don't suffer unnecessarily and die stupidly and prematurely, then think about checking out the essay app. All right, thank you. I'll take a bunch of questions.